Global markets are watching the latest steps by EU officials to contain the Greek debt crisis. Joining us this morning is Robert Zoellick, the head of the World Bank. Bob, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Glad to be with you.
You were on our air, I think it was late April, and at the time, Greece obviously was already a subject of conversation, and you said that any support package that came out of the EU or the IMF should err on the side of too big rather than too small. The one that came down, which side did it err on?
Well, it was big enough, but it just bought time. And so now the question is how the European institutions use that time.
And how do you think that's going to go? We're getting some budget measures out this morning. There's some feeling among some that because the Greek people did not out and out riot last week, that maybe they're coming to terms with some of the austerity measures and won't resist as much as some feared.
Well, I think it's going to be a nerve-wracking run. First, as you said, the markets are going to be watching closely whether governments, not only in Greece, but in other countries, start to exert the same fiscal discipline that Senator Gregg is talking about on the U.S. side. Then there's also going to be a question of, over time, about whether these debts can be paid back. You hear the discussion about restructuring the Greek debt, and that leaves an anxiety in the market. But third, a critical point you haven't heard as much about is policies to stimulate growth. As we saw in Latin America in the 80s, it's very hard to do this if you don't have a growth strategy, too.
What is the best case scenario? What is it in your mind, and what kind of probability are you putting on it?
Well, the best case scenario is that the shock leads the governments to start to get discipline on their budgets, that they start to work at the debt issue. The country's just been living beyond their means. And that also it leads to a change in attitude, as you've seen in East Asia, where countries say after the 90s, we've got to build in growth strategies. Maybe we have to use some deregulation as well as re-regulation in some sectors to allow things to grow.
Do you think, does it necessarily involve a restructuring of debt?
Look, that's the big question mark. And sitting here, I mean, I can't predict, but you look at the numbers with Greece, and you look at the fiscal pain that they're going to have to go under, and you got to ask yourself whether that's going to be sustainable or whether over time somebody's going to have to manage a restructuring. The reason that is abhorrent now in Europe is the thing that you were talking about earlier in the program, the fear of contagion, the fear that this would then require hits on some of the European banks. So it's not an easy question, but I think it's one that delay is not necessarily going to make for a better answer.
Bob, I was just wondering, you wrote an interesting piece which seemed to imply that you thought the growth would come from the developing countries, the BRIC countries, as basically driving and pulling along the developed countries. How do developed countries energize growth when they're facing massive debt crises and potential sovereign debt crises, which will affect their currency, and if they expand government without paying for it, they're basically going to aggravate that problem?
Well, Senator Gregg, you would know in the case of the U.S. and certainly the case of Europe, there's things you can do to expand growth that don't have to do anything about spending. They make it easier to form businesses. They make it easier for people to move in and out of those businesses. We have something called the Doing Business Index that looks at some 8 different indicators across the world of countries to have a sense of how easy it is to form and hire and take other steps. And Greece is listed 120th. It's below Ethiopia and Egypt. So that gives you a sense of some of the steps that could be taken. But I don't just mean to pick on Greece. I mean, if you look at East Asia, they learned some of the lesson from the 90s. So as this crisis broke, they were starting to say, well, maybe we need to open up some of the services markets, whether it be in health or transport or logistics. And I think that's going to have to be on the menu for all of us.
Do you think the IMF has the capacity to step in? They're pretty much at the full extent of their present asset capability. They're asking for another $500 billion. It's not your shop, but where do you see the IMF in this?
Well, they got some additional resources through some loan programs. Some of those still have to be executed. But what they committed as part of this European package was really a standby facility. It wasn't sort of specific funding as of yet. I think the IMF's role is very important, Senator, and this is one of those issues. I know it's hard in the U.S. Congress, but you know, when there is a fire, you do want to make sure that the fireman is there with the water.
Although some people worry about the water supply, you could argue after that Senate vote last week. Do you think that presages some resistance on the part of other communities around the world to help out where help is needed?
I think it's a reflection of a general political concern, which you see, for example, in Germany, where they don't want to bail out some of their partners. In the U.S., obviously, the taxpayer feels that he and she has been sort of driven to the wall. You see this in other countries, and that's what's going to make this really, really difficult to walk the fine line. On the one hand, we have to deal with the financial psychological fears, just as the United States did in 2008, and now Europe's having to do now. But my key point is, that won't be enough. You also have to try to work on some of the budget and fiscal issues that Senator Gregg's been talking about in the U.S., and also some of the policies that can allow the private sector to kick in growth. As your earlier comment said, you're starting to see a recovery in the United States, and it's starting to be broader based. That's a good thing. But events in Europe could bring it down.
Do you think Merkel survives?
Oh, Merkel will survive, but the question is how she does a balance between what her public is telling her and what she needs to do on the European front.
Do you think the bond vigilantes who are setting their sights on Europe will eventually turn that to the U.S. and the fiscal imbalances we have here? And when does that happen?
Well, I think the question of the pricing of sovereign credit is something that you could see starting earlier this year. And indeed, you know, this book by Rogoff and Reinhardt talking about 8 centuries of financial folly really predicted this. It's something that you've seen over time. So I think in the case of the United States, for example, we're not out of the woods yet in some of the municipal markets. Senator Gregg probably knows that better. He was a governor. You know, as you watch some of these municipalities try to balance their budgets in the middle of the year, there's going to also be questions about whether they deserve the credit ratings. So this is not just a European phenomenon. It's going to be one you're going to have to watch worldwide, at least this year and perhaps into next.
And we look forward to having you back as that continues. Bob, thanks for the time today.
You bet.
Robert Zoellick with the World Bank.